If you need cash from a home equity but can't qualify for a traditional loan, you've probably seen these ads or heard about home equity sharing agreements or home equity sharing investments. The premise of these companies is you can access your home equity without monthly payments and with no credit score or income limitations. So sounds great, right? Hi, I'm RJ Weiss, certified financial planner. Over the past few months, I've gone deep, really deep into these agreements. I've not just read the marketing, read what the fine print says, I've really dissected the fine print of each of the major providers and analyzed different scenarios to help you figure out if these are right for you. Overall, I found these companies to be legitimate in that they're solving a real world problem. But, and this is a massive but, they are complex and potentially very expensive. So they can carry significant risks, especially if you don't understand what you're signing. So today I want to break down exactly how these home equity agreements work, the real pros and cons, the hidden costs, and then really put my CFP hat on and explain who these are for and who these are not for. Okay, so in order to understand how these work, we're going to have to get a little technical, but I'm going to try to keep this as simple as possible. All right, first things first, this is not a loan. And really, that's the main appeal. There's no monthly payments, and it's not like you're traditionally accumulating interest on your loan. Instead, the way to think of it is an investment company is taking a portion of your future home's value. Here's the basic exchange. You get a lump sum of cash today based on your current home value today. You give a percentage of your future home's value back to the company when you sell, refinance, or buy out the agreement. And this can be on your own terms, say in 3 to 5 years, or on the agreement's terms, with some agreements capped at 10 years. So one really important thing I want to get straight right away. These agreements are not as simple as saying, hey, this company invested 10% in my home now, and in 5 years later, I'm going to give them 10% back. That's not how these work. These formulas the companies use are way more complex than that. And those details make a huge difference in what you ultimately repay. And we'll get into that soon, but I want to cover a bit more how these are structured. You keep the title and ownership in your home throughout the agreement period. So this company is really protecting their investment with collateral from your home itself. They record a lien against your property similar to what a mortgage would do. Because your investment is secured by your home itself, these companies are way more flexible in who they do agreements with than what you'd find with, say, a mortgage provider or a home equity loan provider. However, in order to qualify, typically you have to have a lot of equity in your house. As a general rule of thumb, most home equity providers are looking for you to have at least 30% equity in your house after the investment is made. But that can vary from company to company. And now here where we start to get a little more complex. If you get a mortgage, if you get a home equity line of credit or a HELOC, these are standardized contracts that are pretty much the same across the board. However, there's not many companies in this space and all of them work very differently from one another. And they all have their own formula for how they calculate the payback rate. But looking at each of the major providers, I found two different types of agreements. The first type is let's call the straight share percentage. So what this might look like is you give up 10% now in exchange for 15% at a later date. But one critical detail here is this percentage isn't always fixed. The percentage can increase the longer you hold the agreement. Let's walk through an example of I found on a website. So say your home is appraised at $500,000 and you receive $50,000 of cash up front. So that's 10% of the current value of the home. So instead of this flat percentage that you're going to owe back, it's broken down into tiers. So say if you settle within 0 to 3 years, you might own 15% back to the home equity investment. If you settle within 4 to 6 years, you're going to owe 17.8% back. And if you settle from 7 to 10 years, you're going to own 20% of your total home value here back to the home equity provider. So let's run some numbers here. Let's say your home value increases from $500,000 to $600,000 over 7 years. Since you settled in year 7, you'll fall within the 7 to 10 year tier, meaning the company is then entitled to do 20% of your total home value. So you would owe them a total of $120,000 in 7 years. And this is after you took out only $50,000 7 years ago. So again, this is not an equal exchange of 10% now for 10% later. And unfortunately, this is kind of the more easier formula to understand. The second structure I found is let's call it the risk adjusted balance structure. This one is a little more complex in a lot of ways. But the core idea here is the company discounts your home value with a starting calculation. And in some ways can lower your risk depending on how you look at it. But it's going to impact how much you have to pay back. So let's use another real world example I took from one of the websites of the major providers. And if you go to Ways to Wealth, I've included in-depth examples on all the reviews I have of each of these providers with actual real case scenarios. So let's again say your home is appraised at $500,000. You get $50,000 of cash up front from the company, but technically it's a little less than that because you're going to pay fees, which we'll cover later. The company then applies adjustment to that $500,000 home value, let's say 27%. So for their calculation, calculation and your starting point, it's really you're sharing a basis above $365,000, which is $500,000 minus 27%. Now let's imagine it's 6 years later on this agreement. Your home hasn't increased in value at all. It's still worth $500,000. So how these contracts work is they then calculate appreciation above that $365,000 mark, which again is $500,000 in this case. So terms that I've seen is they're going to take 21.4% of the appreciation above $365,000, and they're going to have you pay back that original $50,000 that you were given upfront. So what's that going to look like is $50,000 plus $29,000 total. So you effectively paid back $79,000 and received upfront a little less than $50,000. So this is an example where your home didn't increase at all, but because of how these agreements work, you're still on the hook for more money than what was given to you upfront. So there's a couple different ways to look at this, but overall, if you borrowed $50,000 today and had to pay back $79,000 in 6 years, that's just one way to look at this. But one thing to keep in mind is there are some fees. They range from 3 to 5% of the money you receive up front. So if you receive $50,000, you might only get, say, $47,500 of that money. So overall, this is a lot more than what you would typically pay for a home equity line of credit. And this is why these contracts are really for people in a tight financial spot that don't qualify for traditional home loans. So what are some reasons that people may look to sign up for these? These companies don't have strict credit score requirements, nor do they have strict income requirements. A home equity loan provider is going to look at those numbers carefully. So for some people, these might be the only option. Again, another benefit that these companies provide is they do have no monthly payments, so they can get you out of a tight cash flow situation. But overall, I would still look at these more of like a last resort type scenario where you're really looking to avoid financial catastrophes. I'm talking mortgage, bankruptcy, medical emergencies, or maybe say avoiding withdrawing from your 401k or IRA, which may involve a lot of penalties and taxes. In these specific, often difficult situations, home equity agreements could be like the least bad option available. And they might help you stabilize your financial situation, buy you a little more time. But these benefits come with some serious downsides it's important to understand. Let's cover those now. So number one, these can have pretty significant costs. When you share appreciation and that appreciation goes up, the amount of equivalent APR you might look at here is something considerable to what credit card or high interest credit card debt is. So this is well into the double digits. Some companies do provide caps at say 20% around there, but you're still looking at a very high number to borrow money. So again, these are far more expensive than traditional home equity products and really looked at as a last line. The second thing you got to consider here is the forced sale risk. These agreements have end terms. Some are 10 years, some are 20, some are 30 years. So when that term is up, you must get out of the agreement some way or another. So really the ways you're looking at to get out of these agreements are to sell your home, refinance, do a cash out refinance and pay off the provider there. Or if you have available funds by then, which could be 10 to 30 years away, you could just buy out the company, which is likely going to be a lot of cash. But keep in mind, these agreements end. But the big thing here is after 10 years, if you don't have the cash or you can't refinance, you may be forced to sell your home. And if that's not something you're ready to do at the end of 10 years, you really don't have a choice here. You have to get out of this agreement at 10 years. So the third thing I want to point out is really the lack of standardization across the board in all these companies. So every company's contract is a little bit different. The calculation methods, the fees, buyout options, term length, these can vary wildly from company to company. So you need to meticulously review any contract that you get your hands on here. And ideally get help from a professional here who can make sure you really understand these things. The fourth con I see with these things is the terms you're going to see on the website are a lot different than what you're going to get after underwriting. So the online estimators, they often show really rosy scenarios. So to tell you about the fine print that one provider has, they say the pricing scenario assumes a combined loan plus option to value ratio of 49% and a FICO score of 740. Your actual repayment terms will be dependent on final underwriting of your application, the value of your home, property characteristics, and credit information. So the thing about this is, again, these are last resort options for many people. So some people might not have a 740 credit score or might not have that much equity in their home. So what you're seeing on the website could potentially be a lot different than what you get after underwriting. And unfortunately, it's only after you go through underwriting where you get the real value and the real contract. So these are really hard to compare apples to apples because then you need to go through underwriting through two different companies to really compare. All right, so let's put my financial planner hat on for a little here and really look at this from a financial planning perspective. The way to look at these contracts is really as a last resort. These are not to remodel your home, to buy a new car. And in some ways, it's filling a need in the market, but they do come with significant costs. So if you can qualify for a HELOC or home equity loan, those are going to be your best options. They're far more simpler, and it's really easy to really plan your financial future going forward with those options. So just because these don't have monthly payments, you might think of them as beneficial to these, but in reality, don't think of them as something superior to, say, a home equity loan. So it's just really important to understand the trade-off of what you're doing here. I think the easy way, although it's not exactly apples to apples, is to look at this as something similar to, say, borrowing with credit cards. And you look at the effective APRs and realistic scenarios, and often that's what you're going to have to pay back. But the thing is to keep in mind is there's less flexibility with, say, borrowing from credit cards than compared to what you would get from, say, a home equity investment. Credit card debt is a little easier to negotiate, while really there's no negotiating with these companies. And since there is an agreement term that has to end at a certain specified time, there's really no way to get out of that term. So really these tools might make sense if you really face an urgent and unavoidable need and don't have the cash. Again, foreclosure prevention, critical home repairs that might allow you to sell your home, or maybe even the unfortunate circumstance of a medical emergency. And if you're in those situations, it's important to have a clear plan and realistic plan on the back end as far as how you're going to pay this off and what your budget is going to look like afterwards. Because obviously you dug yourself in a hole, and it is what it is. But going forward with no monthly cash flow payments, how are you going to improve your financial situation? These are things you got to know up front. So something I want to repeat, since these are a last resort, these are generally not for, say, spending on vacations, spending for lifestyle, spending for improvements in your home, buying a new car. If you simply just like the idea of avoiding a monthly payment when you qualify for a loan, these are not the types of products to do that. So I understand that some people really have no other option. That's who I really made this video for. And I want to include some resources for you to learn more about these products. So on theways2wealth.com, I've included detailed guides of the major providers, which use real-world examples from each of their websites and each of their contracts. I've also included some side-by-side comparisons so you can decide what company is right for you. Also, I'm going to link to a Consumer Financial Protection Bureau article on these agreements so you can really get an unbiased opinion of what they actually do. I want to reiterate, this is a huge decision, often involving your largest asset. So you really want to do your homework here. I hope this video gave you a little more clarity about what these investments actually are and how they work. If you find that helpful, please give this video a like. It really helps others find this information.